I start? Good morning and good afternoon, distinguished participants from Asia and the Pacific. On behalf of the UN Human Rights Office, UNICEF, and UN Environment Programme, I would like to warmly welcome everyone to the session titled Engaging Business to Promote, Protect, and Respect Children's Rights to the Healthy Environment. Children and the youth are most vulnerable to the harms of climate change and environmental degradation. A 2018 report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment notes that air pollution, water pollution, and exposure to toxic substances, together with other types of environmental harm, caused 1.5 million deaths to children under the age of 5 every year and contributes to disease, disabilities, and early mortalities throughout their life. Given the onerous impact of environmental harms on children, in 2020, UN Human Rights Office, UNICEF, and UNEP, Regional Office for the Asia Pacific, developed principles and policy guidance on children's rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment to introduce practical suggestions to combat these effects and has a specific focus on business responsibilities to uphold children's right to the healthy environment in ASEAN. Our session today will begin with an introduction to the principles and policies. This presentation will explain how UNEP, UNICEF, and UN Human Rights intend to begin piloting implementation of the principles and policy guidance and invite suggestions on how to focus these efforts. Case study examples on the current situation of climate and environmental impacts on children linked to the business sector in the region will be shared. These sessions will then bring youth representatives and experts together to talk about their mutual expectations, share examples of how they are already working together, and discuss what they can do to implement these principles and policy guidance target as business. Together with me today, I have Mr. Sujay Natson, Regional Climate Change and Environment Consultant at UNICEF, to introduce the principle and policy guidance. We also have the youth representative, Surabhi Wanalia from OSCHR, and Wow Westiu, the executive director and founder of the Association of Young Environmental Journalists in the Philippines, who will be the moderators and moderate the panel discussion with our excellent panelists today. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the session to Sujay, followed by Srabi and Wow. Sujay, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Omchad. Now I finally unmuted myself. I hope everyone can see the PowerPoint slides that are on the screen as well. And yes, thank you. So it gives me great pleasure to speak on behalf of the three UN agencies, UN Human Rights, UN Environment Program, as well as UNICEF, as we jointly develop this policy guidance and principles on children's rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So this has been the culmination of almost a year's work of consultations with experts across the three agencies. And I'm not sure how much justice I'll be able to do within trying to squeeze a year's work within 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. So before we jump straight into the content of and what exactly is the principles and policy guidance, I'm going to do a quick, yep. So I think it'd be really useful to kind of go through, what is the current movement that is taking place globally, both at the international level as well as at the grassroots level, and growing recognition for children's environmental rights that's happening. So as many of you know, in 1989, that's when the Convention on the Rights of the Child was first introduced. But then after its adoption, it's only more in the recent years that the aspect of children's environmental rights has been gaining traction and also recognition at both the global level as well as the grassroots level. So in 2018, the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Environment published a report on the children's rights to a healthy environment. And in 2019, as many of you know, youth around the world mobilized on trying to demand climate justice and demand for their environmental rights through climate strikes, which culminated in about 4 million people in 2019 across 150 countries. And it was in October of last year, just recently, where the Human Rights Council passed a resolution on realizing the rights of children through a healthy environment, with some very specific requests made to states, but as well as businesses in their resolutions. And as many of you know as well, there's a growing requirement, or I guess growing recognition of the responsibility of businesses, as well as accountability of businesses to act and respect children's environment, and to act on the climate crisis in general. And I think many of you have already been watching the news as to what's been happening at Shell, at ExxonMobil, just in the past recent weeks alone. So why exactly even do we need principles and policy guidance on children's environmental rights? Just to give a bit of background, about 1/3 of the region population is made of children. And Southeast Asia in particular is actually one of the most affected by the climate crisis, with about 95% of disasters in the region being climate related, which has resulted in about $80 billion in losses annually. And this is not even including the environmental degradation impacts that are also associated in the region, such as air pollution, which is known to affect about more than 95% of children across the region. So in light of this, at the moment, there isn't really a normative or practical guidance specifically on what can you do in terms of advocating for children's rights in the environmental context, be it at the international level or at the regional level. And oftentimes, those who are working on children's rights, as well as those who work on protecting the environment, don't tend to always be talking to each other, and tend to focus on one topic to the exclusion of the other. And we felt that's where this policy guidance actually come into play in filling that gap. If you are a business who wants to act and do more on protecting children's rights in the environmental context, what can you do? If you are a CSO or civil society organization who's working with businesses and you want to encourage them and guide them along protecting children's rights in the context of environment and climate change, what can you do? That's the kind of practical guidance that we really want to give through this policy guidance that we have developed. So the previous special rapporteur on human rights and environment mentioned that the climate crisis essentially is a child rights crisis because it infringes on the most basic of their rights, including the right to health, right to food, as well as water and sanitation. And the current special rapporteur, Dr. David Boyd, went even further to say that children's the right to a healthy environment, it's probably the most important human rights of the 21st century. So as mentioned, it's going to be a bit tricky to try and squeeze the whole document of recommendations within the next few minutes I have. So one of the suggestions that we have is what I've put on top on the screen now is a QR code that you can see. So if you would like to follow along and if you would like to review the policy guidance for yourself as well, refer to it, you can follow the QR code, which will take you to a download page for the draft document. So I want to emphasize that this document that you find online is still the draft version. So there's still some final changes being made to it, and especially in formatting, etc. But at least for now, with the content, we feel it might be useful for you to refer to. So how is the document being structured? So there's two main sections. The first half of it is the principles. So we've developed about 37 principles kind of like covering both the procedural as well as the substantive rights of children's environmental aspects. And then we'll go into the policy guidance as to how can you practically apply these principles. And we've kind of focused on 5 main stakeholder groups, as you can see, and one of them is businesses. So just to briefly bring you through the main categories of principles that we have covered in the guidance. We try to cover both the participation as well as the access to information, children's environmental education, aspects of pollution and loss of biodiversity. And we have a specific section specific on business and children's rights to a healthy environment, as well as enforcement and as well as a few other aspects such as allocation of resources. So going specifically into the rights relating to businesses, there are 5 principles that we cover in the document. These cover the legal and financial responsibility of businesses, as well as the inclusion of child rights due diligence as part of environment and social assessments. And we also try to specifically, enforce and kind of include and kind of emphasize the importance of the informal sector. Children who are involved in the informal sector or who are affected by the informal sector, either through the pollution or because their family members are engaged in it, we try to also recognize them in this policy guidance. And lastly, mechanisms to raise awareness and encourage actions by businesses. So recommendations of how do you actually go about applying the principles, we try to make it as practical as possible. And of course, these are not comprehensive, but at least we try to make it in a way so that they can also be adapted to the context of the country or context of the business sector itself. And many of the recommendations are relevant to businesses across states as well as specifically in the section for businesses. So if you look at the section on states, you can see that we've made some recommendations such as requiring licenses processes to include the participation of children, as well as encouraging sustainable entrepreneurships, monitoring of impacts that also go beyond borders, so transboundary accountability mechanisms, and as well as for states to actually use the environmental fees and taxes and reinvesting them into preventing and minimizing environmental harm to children. So the section on businesses specifically, we try to make it as practical as possible for businesses to directly take them up and implement it through the business processes. So for example, like implementing social environmental disclosure standards in line with globally accepted standards, training of staff on children's environmental rights, working with shareholders to kind of increase their awareness of children's environmental rights and taking action on them. As well as transboundary activities and impacts. And we try to also cover other areas such as including child-friendly information that your business practices can distribute within communities, and providing regular spaces where children and youth can actually interact and engage in the development of business strategies to ensure their protection to a healthy environment. And lastly, we also try to include some relevant resources and tools that are already out there. So this includes the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as a few other tools that cover child rights, as well as some aspects of environmental rights. So it's an easy reference document for everyone if you're interested in pushing the agenda on children's environmental rights with your partners or within your own businesses. So we can have a one-stop reference document for all of this. So I guess I'm about to close it off here, but I think just want to end off on this note that we have in the document and also with this QR code so you can have easy access to it. But the private sector plays an important role as duty bearers to uphold and respect children's environmental rights, be it formal, informal, and transboundary business activities. So thank you so much, and I'll hand this floor over to Surabhi, who's going to be introducing the panelists.
Welcome everyone to the first round of the panel discussion. We will be hearing from our panelists who will be presenting their work on children's right to a healthy environment. We have an excellent panel with us here today. They bring with them wide-ranging perspectives, including from NGOs, a waste picker cooperative, and the legal sector. Before we get started, I would like to express our gratitude to the panelists for being here today. Your time and expertise on this matter is greatly appreciated. And a note to the audience, we encourage you to please post your questions regarding the policy guidance and the panelist presentations as they come up. Please keep your questions concise and let us know which speaker they are directed to. And I will jump into the introductions. We will first hear from Harshad Barde, Director of Swachh Pune. Harshad will be providing us an overview of his role as a director of India's first autonomous waste pickers cooperative, providing waste collection and management services to over 850,000 properties in Pune. Harshad is a lawyer turned environmental labor activist with experience in developing local and national solid waste management legislation. We will then be joined by Itsarapon Dauram, the country coordinator for Thailand and children's right to a healthy environment for Terre des Hommes, Germany. Terre des Hommes is a child rights-based organization working with and for children and establishes objectives on key thematic areas. Their strategy goal number 3 is to protect children's right to a healthy environment. Terre des Hommes empowers young people to create dialogue with decision makers, which includes states, the business sector, and all stakeholders. Further, we are joined by Sati Nagra, providing a legal sector perspective on this policy guidance. She has assisted UNICEF East Asia and the Pacific Regional Office with its work to develop children's rights to a healthy environment, including through her input in the initial workshops developing this guidance. Sati is an associate at King & Wood Mallesons in Sydney and practices in all aspects of international dispute resolution. Her experience includes international arbitration, public international law, and international risks. Finally, we will close this panel session with Olaf Blomqvist of Save the Children. Olaf is Save the Children's Senior Humanitarian Advocacy and Policy Manager for Asia. He was previously the Research and Advocacy Director for our ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights and a researcher for Amnesty International. He has also worked for Médecins Sans Frontières and the International Crisis Group, while his educational background is at the University of London, UK. I would like to now hand over to Harshad to share his experience as the director of Swachh Pune and the linkages between children and environmental rights in the informal waste sector. Over to you, Harshad.
Surabhi, and thank you to UNEP for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to try and touch upon the rights of children in the informal waste picking sector, as well as the overall informal recycling sector. Informal waste pickers are essentially those who are engaged in collecting, sorting, and selling dry recyclable materials that are found on the streets, in landfills, alongside water bodies, or anywhere in the urban cities, and selling them into scrap. The World Bank estimates that around 1 to 3% of the urban working population in developing nations constitute of informal waste pickers. That means around 5 to 15 million people in India are engaged in waste picking, and this also includes children waste pickers. Essentially, waste pickers form the base of the recycling pyramid in any developing country, and to some extent in the developed world as well. The sector, as it is organized, starts with the waste pickers, the informal waste pickers, right at the base, and it goes on to scrap traders, local aggregators, and thereafter into informal waste processors, and then finally linked to formal large-scale recycling organizations as well. A lot of them from the petroleum sector, because the focus of recycling is shifting more and more towards plastic recycling. And in this way, they not only deal with the post-consumer waste, but they also form a critical part of the supply chain in the circular economy today. The contribution of waste pickers and in terms of diversion of waste, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions has been very well documented. However, it's not been legislated adequately enough in terms of providing them any kind of social security or social welfare or preserving their right to livelihood as it changes very quickly, as the urban sanitation scenario changes very quickly in the developing worlds. As far as children go, the incidence of child labor as well as children at work in the informal waste picking sector is quite prevalent. It is inversely proportional to the level of organization and mobilization that has happened amongst the informal waste pickers in any particular area. The more waste pickers are organized, the less you will find children in waste picking. Um, the nature of the work and the nature of the sector is such that, simply put, there is no entry barrier, there are no regulations, tracking mechanisms to ensure that waste picker children are not waste picking. Combine that with the absence of adequate healthcare, as well as the absence of access to decent education and extreme poverty, ensures that you continue to find children in the waste picking sector. And over the last 1 year, 1.5 years, the COVID situation has exacerbated the precarious nature of the work, as well as the presence of waste pickers. Just our city of Pune having recorded more than double the number of dropouts in the last 1 year, who are dropout of children who have dropped out of formal education and who have started coming to work. Now, children end up at work not only because in the form of child labor, but also simply because their parents have nowhere and no one to take care of them. And yet, at the same time, the work that the waste pickers do, as well as the work that child waste pickers do, directly contributes towards sustainable environment. The way in which businesses finally interact with the informal waste picking community, I think twofold when it comes to the right of children to a healthy environment. The first one is in the manner in which waste is managed, or, well, to be honest, mismanaged to a great extent. Um, Companies, producers, manufacturers, um, produce different kinds of goods, and the post-consumer waste, the way in which it is managed, directly impacts children. You have a lot of children who are engaged in e-waste management, plastic recycling, and the processes for managing this waste usually end up burning e-waste materials or introducing harmful chemicals. And the children who are either waste picking, or children who are at work with their parents, or children from poorer communities which are located in and around landfills, as well as water bodies, are directly impacted by the mismanagement of the post-consumer waste that appears in our systems. Secondly, it's as a part of supply chains. As I said, this sector is the base of most of the recycling that happens in developing world, and all the recycling goods that are used are finally coming from this sector. And businesses need to be a little more aware of where the material is coming from. As goes with all informal occupations, there is a high level of informality, there's a high level of poverty, and no regulation to track where this waste is coming from. And businesses really need to invest uh, in upgrading the infrastructure used in recycling, in ensuring that children are able to access better education, that you do not have any child labor in your supply chain, especially those who are claimed to be using sustainable goods, sustainable manufacturing processes by using recycled materials, so on and so forth. One example of this is a project that we are attempting to run in Pune, where in the paper recycling sector, as well as the government and the waste picker groups have come together to invest in identifying child labor and increasing the livelihoods of the parents of child labor, so that the children can be sent into formal education again. I'll stop here because the time is really limited and there's a lot many more things to say. Back to you, Sylvie.
Thank you, Harshad. Thank you very much for the insight to the linkage between children and environmental rights in the informal waste sector, especially your highlighting of the drivers of child labor and the business processes that contribute to these challenges. I would like to invite Porn to share her work at Terre des Hommes in addressing the effects of pollution from mining activities on children. And she will also elaborate on actions that businesses can take to prevent similar impacts. Over to you, Terapon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And also hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to me here for to chance to have a chance to share about our experiences as status on Germany as a child rights-based organization who work with and for children and young people. We empower the young people to voice out their voice their voice out their opinion to any policy that impact to their life and the community and to ensure that protection to any rights violation, which are include the children's and also their community affected by the environmental pollution for the business activity, such as big big development project, for example, mining in Philippines or in Thailand, mercury mining in Indonesia, or even the mega project, for example, dam the contribution in Mekong region. So that kinds of the project can also harmful and also create a lot of the environment pollution and all the impact of the abuse the rights of the child. But when we are talking about a community where with the children affected by the environment and pollution from the business activity, one of the community that our youth group or the young people share their story as a lesson learned about the access to the remedy and also how it effective is the case of Kriti Creek in Kriti Lang community in Kanchanaburi provinces in Thailand. That area where is 15,000 tons of the toxic lead uncollected sitting on the river bed. Research shows a lot about the fish and the plants contain more than 500 tons of the acceptable level of the lead content. So although that the company all the processing plant have been closed already, they win in the court and get the compensation and now still going on with the rehabilitation process, but still unclear about the long-term negative impact to the children and environment. Even today, the budgets of the Kitty Creek residents show high lead level. That is mean even for this one case, it's more than 40, 50 years that campaign for our clean water. Does it mean two generations of the critical community that take all the burden and also the most vulnerable group is the children. That's why we come here together today to discuss about it. Because it's the children themselves, they bear the burdens far longer than adults. For this critical case, children get the impact and take all the burden since from they were born until some of them be the adult today already. So the next generation as the children and young people also have the question, and then how many more years that need the children must endure this toxicity, struggle to survive with the illness and deformity. The young people at the Kriti Youth Network or Kriti Rangijang also ask for the justice for the children and youth and for our community member. The young people follow up with the court case and for the clean up for the pollution and ask for the sustainable solution. And when their representative and also their friends from another area in the region who have the same problem have a chance to share their views and recommendations on the policy guideline on the children's right to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment by the UNICEF, UNEP, and OCHA as the youth expert. That really, they are very exciting and also it's really meaningful for their participation process that affected to the policy that affected to their life. So that is mean they also would like to mention it here, and I bring or some highlight for four important recommendations that strongly recommend from them to ensure the positive change as the effective and the prompt access to remedy. One of the important recommendations from them is they require the child right impact assessment maybe need to be included in EIA, EHIA, or SEA, or can be a new initiative. And also like for business and investor, need to have the risk management and mitigation plan to open any and all with open for consultation process, which include the participation of the children such as including them in public hearing process, or even create to support the safe space that need to be simplified, or the policy and remedies and also the project information to the children to understand well enough before they can express their thought and their opinion based on their knowledge, skill, and ability to all decision making process. And then we come into this one, it's really highlighted and also reflect in this policy on this guideline. It's about the legal protecting of the children. For this one, we would like to specify for also the children who get negative impact from the business activity to ensure the compensation and rehabilitation process that will cause or have more potential cause environmental harm or health or their well-being in the future. For example, the case in the dam collapse in Laos, that is no process on this remedy to cover after the business activity that impact to the children's rights and abuse their well-being. It happened later after they built it already. So that is very strongly recommend that we have legally protecting. And according to the example for the investment in another country, so that is mean the regional and global business human rights treaty have to provide the extraterritorial jurisdiction and effective remedy for cross-border or trans-boundary business and investment in another country. Because right now it's very challenging that how they can exercise to claim their rights and also in the same time that how the state that have the business for the cross-border business can take their responsibility. So taking this child right perspective into the business principle is so important because it can emphasize that state obligation to protect the rights of the child. Business and governments have the responsibility to provide the remedy for those who are affected from the negative impact that happened to the business activity. So right now we have this initiative for the policy guideline. I hope that we can make use of this, include in the process, not only for the court case, but also that the whole process from the beginning of the project or business investment and also the further harm in the future. So that's all from me right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Itzarapon. We saw the effects of lead pollution from mining and dam projects on children's right to a healthy environment, and your suggestions to strengthen the investment monitoring, planning, and remedial laws were highlighted as important steps to take forward. I would just like to remind the audience to put any questions that you have in the Q&A chat box. And now I would like to invite Sati Nagra to talk us through some of the latest litigation which has changed the landscape for children's rights, as well as the pro bono support that King & Wood Mallesons has provided to UNICEF. Over to you, Sati.
Rabi. Good afternoon from Sydney, and thank you very much for having me here. As Rabi mentioned, I'll summarise some of the latest climate litigation developments here in Australia as well as overseas, and how that might impact business behaviour in the context of the global response to climate change and environmental degradation. And secondly, if we have time, as an example of how businesses can promote respect for children's rights to a healthy environment, I'll talk about some of the pro bono support that King & Wood Mallesons, which is the firm that I work for, has provided UNICEF over the last few years. So on the first point, as many of you will know, there have been 3 significant climate-related judgments handed down in the last week or so, 1 against Shell in the Netherlands and 2 here in Australia, against Whitehaven Coal and another against Bravus Mining, formerly Adani. I'll give a quick summary of the first 2, and I'll circulate a link to a case summary in the Q&A function for anyone interested in more detail. But with respect to the case against Shell, this was a class action brought against Shell by environmental groups, supported by over 17,000 individuals, and they argued that Shell's contributions to climate change violated its duty of care under Dutch law, as well as under various human rights obligations. And the Hague District Court held that Shell had indeed violated the standard of care under Dutch law, and it ordered Shell to drastically reduce its carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030, and that's relative to 2019 levels. Now, that carbon dioxide reduction applies throughout Shell's entire global energy portfolio, encompassing scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So that's emissions from Shell's own operations, its suppliers, and also its end user customers. And Shell was ordered to implement that reduction target with immediate effect. So that's irrespective of any appeal. And Shell certainly has indicated that it will appeal. The second case is against Whitehaven Coal's Vickery Extension project here in Australia. And this was a class action brought by 8 Australian teenagers, so particularly relevant to our discussion on children's environmental rights. They sought to prevent the Australian government from approving Whitehaven Coal's proposal to expand a coal mine in New South Wales. And they argued that the Australian government owed all Australian children a duty of care when considering whether to approve that particular project, as it would exacerbate climate change and cause them serious future harm. And they were able to quantify the tons of carbon dioxide emissions that would be emitted into the atmosphere as a result of burning all the coal within that mine. And in a milestone judgment last week, the Australian Federal Court agreed that the government does indeed owe Australia's children a duty of care to avoid causing them harm when assessing this specific project proposal. But that's not the end of it. There will be more submissions, and this will be very interesting for all of us, where the courts may consider if the government's duty of care to Australian children extends beyond this specific project to the general extraction of coal in Australia. And then the last case is a bit technical. It was brought by the Australian Conservation Foundation, which is a well-known NGO here in Australia, against a government decision regarding a water scheme proposal for Adani's Carmichael coal mine in Queensland. But I will refer you to the case summary that I'll circulate later for details of that. So how might these judgments engage businesses in respecting children's environmental rights? Well, with respect to the Shell case, it marks a very significant precedent that companies, not just countries, can be compelled to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And that's significant because Shell is a private actor and as such not strictly bound by obligations under the Paris Agreement, which is a treaty between states. The court also found that Shell's responsibility to act in line with the Paris Agreement is based on a recognition that businesses must respect human rights. And in this respect, the court was happy to refer to the UNGPs, the guiding principles on business and human rights, despite its soft law status. And you'll see in the principles and policy guidance that those UNGPs are also referred to there. And then lastly, with respect to the Shell case, the court acknowledged that the largest greenhouse gas emitters are expected to bear a commensurately larger burden in taking climate action. And that's irrespective of how difficult it might be for businesses that are vested in carbon-heavy industry, and their business model is structured upon that. Regarding the Australian class action by the Australian teenagers, this is particularly relevant to our discussion of children's environmental rights and the particular issues faced by children with regards to access to remedy and particular vulnerability to environmental harms, as the principles and policy guidance note. First of all, it's generally more difficult for children to secure access to remedy through judicial bodies such as courts, as children typically don't have legal standing to bring a claim in their personal capacity. And in this case, that hurdle was overcome by appointing a litigation representative who, under Australian law, can act on behalf of another person, and in this case was an 86-year-old nun. Secondly, the court recognised that children are particularly vulnerable to climate change harm by reason of their youth. It stated very much that the full intensity of climate change harm is delayed and will only be experienced by persons of a younger age. And lastly, noting timing, I'll leave it at this, but I'll refer everyone who's interested in reading judgments to paragraph 293 of Justice Bromberg's decision, where there are some really compelling statements made on the future climate and environmental harms to children, which are characterized as what might fairly be described as the greatest intergenerational injustice ever inflicted by one generation of humans upon the next. Thanks very much, Srabi, and I'll talk about the pro bono assistance later.
Thank you very much, Sati, for sharing your knowledge on the transformative changes in light of these judgments. It seems as though there are some great opportunities for businesses to be involved. And finally, we will hear from Olaf on the work that Save the Children is doing in promoting and advocating for children's rights. He will also be sharing best practices on this topic from around the world. Over to you, Olaf.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. It's not easy following such a great set of speakers, but I'll try my best. I'm here today to talk a little bit about the work that Save the Children has done in the region and globally on children's rights and environment, and in particular what we've done to promote inclusion of children and to really try to highlight children's voices in decision-making processes. I think, like a lot of other speakers have said already, children are among those vulnerable to climate change, but it's also important to remember that they're among those groups that have done the least to bring about the current climate change crisis. To set the stage for the work we've done in Asia, I'd first like to go through a survey that Save the Children co-produced with a few other NGOs and UN agencies last year, where we surveyed almost 10,000 children across the region. We spoke to children of all ages in countries including Bangladesh, China, India, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Philippines about their hopes and fears for the future and about their attitudes towards climate change. Most of the respondents belong to the group of 10 to 15-year-olds, which were about half of the 10,000 or so respondents. It was clear that climate change was a very, very strong concern. About 15% of those children we spoke to identified it as the top concern in the region, and more than 90% said that it was as a concerning issue as a whole. Even more worrying was the fact that almost everyone we spoke to said that they had experienced some kind of consequence of climate change in their communities. A lot of people identified extreme temperatures, floods, intense rains, but it was also very worrying to see that many spoke of decreased economic opportunities within the community. So it's clear that this is a crisis that's affecting children already across the region. We also asked children to identify solutions. Many of these are very practical, call on governments and businesses to take steps to mitigate effects of climate change crisis by lowering emissions, strengthening legislation, and so on. For businesses in particular, children stress the need to companies to protect the environment, to meet emission standards, and to take practical steps to contribute to help in mitigating greenhouse gases. But the really key recommendation that came out of this survey was that children wanted a seat at the table. Children are extremely worried about the climate, and they want some way to influence and impact decisions. At Save the Children, we see this as key for a number of reasons. There are obviously obligations under the CRC, for example, to include children meaningfully in decisions that affect their future and affect their human rights. But beyond just these obligations, there are a number of practical and very beneficial reasons for including children. Children and youth are communicators of impacts and risks. They inform their own communities on climate mitigation practices. They often see issues and see problems that others don't. Children and youth are also incredibly innovative agents of change. They're excellent at identifying new ways of finding solutions and finding ways of mitigating the risk of the climate crisis. And finally, of course, it's important to include children to build the next generation of climate activists and the next generation of citizens who will help mitigate this crisis. So how do we do this practically at Save the Children? In Asia, in 2019, we launched a region-wide campaign that we call the Red Alert campaign that is aimed at both highlighting the particular impacts of the climate crisis on children, but also focusing on raising children's voices. Some of this is advocacy focused, so we carry out both public and private advocacy with key stakeholders, including governments, intergovernmental bodies, and businesses, to really highlight the key vulnerabilities of children and highlight practical steps that can be taken to protect children better. But much of this is also really focused on building the next generation of climate leaders. So we've worked during the pandemic. We've moved a lot of this online. So we've organized something we call digital hangouts, where we've built up online working groups for children in different countries across the region, where we provide them with a platform to discuss climate change, share ideas, and to also to develop their own workshops, where we, as Save the Children, we provide very basic guidance, but we basically leave it up to the children themselves to develop their own messaging and their ideas. We're hoping to expand this into something we're calling a climate academy, where we'll provide even more in-depth training to children and really focus on developing practical skills for children to become advocates themselves. And what we really want this to be is to lead to development of formal platforms in as many countries as possible in Asia, where children have a way of interacting directly with decision makers, with governments, with businesses, to raise the concerns and make sure that children themselves are consulted in all key decisions in climate change. Finally, just a very quick word on some global initiatives we have that could be relevant as well. I'd like to mention the Children's Rights and Business Principles, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call are aware of already. This was a set of principles that were first proposed in 2010 that the UN Global Compact, Save the Children, and UNICEF led the process of developing, and they were finalized in 2012. The purpose of these guidelines are to help companies, both big and small, to essentially analyze the core businesses and to find ways to improve the lives of children. There are some strong recommendations on the environment in these principles, in particular when it comes to the impact of buying land, which is a huge issue in a lot of Asia, of course. So that is something that we still see as a very core document and something that we're working to promote directly with businesses. And on that level, we have something we call the Child Rights and Business Global Hub, which is based in Europe, in between the UK and Sweden, which is focused on engaging directly with companies on how these principles and other child rights issues can be taken into account. A lot of this work so far has focused on child labor, but climate is definitely a growing priority, and we're currently working on a new strategic plan from next year onwards, where climate will be front and center for this global hub. I'll leave it there for now. I'm happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf, for closing the panel by sharing the concerns of children through the Save the Children survey, as well as the advocacy work that is done to address these concerns. I particularly like the sense of community that Save the Children has created in this regard. Being mindful of the time, I would like to quickly close this session by thanking our panelists once again for their insightful presentations. This has provided a fantastic foundation for our following panel discussions. I will be handing over to Val Vestil, who will be moderating the panel discussion on the topic, how businesses can promote and apply the policy guidance. Val is an accomplished communications practitioner. Currently, he's a part-time instructor at the Development Communications Department of Xavier University, Ateneo de Cagayan, and the executive director of the Association of Young Environmental Journalists. Over to you, Val.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Surabi. Good morning from the Philippines. I am honored to moderate the panel discussion for this session. We have derived some questions for our panelists from their excellent presentations in the previous segment in order for them to give more insights, further clarity, and maybe deep dive on expert opinions that they may have aligned with businesses under the principles and policy guidelines on children's rights to a safe, clean, and healthy and sustainable environment. For our live audiences or online viewers, if at any point in the discussion you may have questions or queries ruminating over your mind, please do express them through the Q&A function of this interface, and we will do our best to entertain them later on in the discussion. Let's get the ball rolling. In the previous segment, we heard from 4 experts share their ideas and insights of how businesses can promote and apply the policy guidelines. This first question goes out to Harshad from Swash Pune. Now, in the principles and policy guidance on children's rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in the ASEAN region. Principle 29 there, displayed on the screen, specifically states that ensuring protection for children of all groups and backgrounds who are involved in the informal sector, and particularly for children who are exposed to chemicals, toxic substances, and wastes, and processes that cause or have the potential to cause environmental harm or harm to children's health. Now, with this principle in mind, what role do you see the policy guidance playing in promoting children's rights to the environment in the informal sector, especially for children in the waste picking community? What do you think? What more do you think is needed for strengthening and upholding their rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? Harshad, please indulge us.
Thank you. So I think the primary focus is always going to be on ensuring that incidents of child labor are eliminated on one hand. And on the other hand, wherever children are present with their parents but not working, children living in poorer communities in and around landfills, as well as dumping spots. And it's usually these things happen only around marginalized communities. That in these specific cases, the rights of children are protected. How the policy principles might assist towards this objective, I think, is firstly in promoting transparency in supply chains. Finally, all of this material that is managed by the waste pickers or by children waste pickers is it ends up in the production cycle, and even the largest FMCG companies, MNCs, as well as small local industries benefit from the supply chain. So ensuring a transparency in that supply chain, identifying wherever child labor incidents are taking place, or wherever the rights of children are being affected by burning of waste or unfair trade practices, or poor environmental standards in small informal recycling or even formal recycling processes. These need to be identified and addressed by those who benefit from that or profit from that supply chain. And as I said before, on the other hand, it is also through the concept of taking responsibility for your products. So product stewardship, looking at where your post-consumer waste is ending up, how it is being managed, and taking responsibility for its safe, environmentally safe management. So we know that a lot of e-waste, electronic as well as electrical waste, is handled by children, is handled by the informal sector and the formal sector, to be honest, in an extremely hazardous manner that directly impacts children. If you're a producer, if you're a manufacturer or a brand owner who benefits from plastic packaging, or electronic goods, or any of the umpteen items that we are producing, you must look at where your waste is landing up, who is managing it, and how it is entering the production cycle again. Because you, as a business, whether you're small or you're an MNC, you profit monetarily from the mismanagement of this waste. And therefore, investing in these processes, making sure that that bottom line, and not just CSR, but that bottom line profit is only calculated after ensuring safe environmental management of your goods, will have a huge impact on the children's right to a healthy environment. And that if there are CSR or other kind of initiatives that are being taken, then access of the waste picking community children, those who are working or those who are at work but not working, their access to education as well as health daycare is something that organizations, businesses can definitely invest in.
Very well placed, Harshad. And I think those are very important takeaways that our audiences from the business sectors should pay attention to. Transparency in supply chains and product stewardship, really looking at the production cycle. As a business, we need to see from the perspective of how it is produced, how it's distributed, how it's consumed, and all that cycle. Very important things that Harshad mentioned there. We'll go back to you in a while, Harshad, for more questions. But now we turn over to Itzarapon, and I want to hear from the insights of Itzarapon from principle number 32 in the policy guidance, which states, and this is a long one, but briefly, no, adopting and implementing appropriate measures that empower and enable children of all groups and backgrounds to effectively and promptly access effective remedies for environmental harm, including through child friendly, inclusive, and age appropriate grievance mechanisms, independent tribunals, and what have you. What has been your experience, or what has been Terde Om's experience in accessing remedies and grievance mechanisms? We'd love to know how have they been useful and or accessible by children or those representing children? How do you see the policy guidance affecting the situation in the communities that you work with, especially in terms of environmental pollution? Sarah po?
Thank you very much, Wow. And that is also a very good question because as I told you during my presentation earlier, I mentioned a lot about this very good opportunity that as a young people and also as a youth expert as you have the meaningful participation on this policy guideline because it includes a lot and show that the state and also like the international community would like to protect the rights of the child. For me, I saw about this is very important because if we not exactly looking for that how we can making them to accept to the remedy well according to the age, it might be another recipe. For example, right now as I shared about the case study of Kritilang in Thailand, you might see the long negative impact that happened to them still, even 50 years already. But if the business adopted this policy guideline into their practice as a policy commitment. That is might see like they can develop in from the adopted children's and business principles and adopted this policy guideline. They can include the participation of the children. What's going to be affected to for them in the long run? And they can look into that process itself for as the child rights situation analysis, do the risk assessment for their business plan well, and also the mitigation plan. Then they can come a bit closer for looking for what exactly by that. But need to ensure the participation that is meaningful. For example, like everything about the right to access information for the project where they're gonna be happen. And also in the same time, they need to know about all the protection or the remedy that provide for the young people by including them from the public hearing process. Right now, the children and young people even don't have the regulations or don't have a chance to include in public hearing for that project or business investment will be happen in their community. So if we adopted this policy guideline, that is mean we include first phase of participation, the right to participation of the children, and then they can rest their voice what is going to be happen to them or affect for their future. And then I would like to go down a bit that if they have the child rights impact assessment, well, assess to the what is will be affected to the right to survival of the children. What is the health problem that's gonna happen with them? The lead will gonna be in there, but how long? And then also in the future. And then also like right now, existing right now, the impact assessment are existing or establish the protection mechanism for them happen is have or not, and then need to be established. And then also like a lot of the business cause another problem. For example, environment, and also sometimes they need to relocate the people and then cause the problem of children on the move. So that is mean they need to have the really impact assessment on the related or the further harm for the children include in that because of this policy guideline mentioned to it. And yeah, that I think this might be really helpful, even the project that is going on right now. As I told you about the Kritilang and also like the dam collapse in Laos, for example, like that. It can use this principle to helping to review and then compensation and the rehabilitation process also. That is my response. Wow, thank you.
Very meaty response. Thank you, Sarapon. It really goes down to the bottom line of getting these policy guidance in place, even at the inception, even at the development phase of the business plan, in the business planning. And I think that's one specific emphasis that Itzarapon had shared in her answer to that question. Speaking of remedies and environmental litigation, we go now to Sati from King and Wood Malisons. We want you to take a look at this subsection. There's a subsection of principles and actions specifically referring to enforcement and access to justice. And in your presentation, you had shared our wins in Australia and other nations in environmental litigation. Now, one of the recommendations for implementing them is to provide legal support to children with legitimate causes of action arising from environmental harm, whether directly through government appointed mechanisms or through financial assistance to independent bodies, including civil society organizations, to enable them to provide such legal support. Now, Sati, what legal support mechanisms are available to children generally when facing environmental harm, and how can businesses and especially law firms engage with them on this? Sati?
Thanks very much. I suppose as a starting point, the legal support mechanisms available will always really depend on the very specific circumstances of the case, the sort of remedy that you're seeking, and also the country in which an individual is based or where the harm occurred. There are a lot of variables there. Support that's typically available in terms of legal resources and so forth are citizens' advice bureaus, civil society organizations that otherwise operate in this space, and perhaps community legal services. For example, in Australia, we have the Environmental Defenders Office, which is a non-government accredited legal service that specializes in environmental law. How can law firms engage? Well, it's a very complex scenario when you have a particular remedy that you're seeking, knowing what your avenues are, and in fact, which ones are viable if you are a child, what sort of procedural rules might be available to assist with you actually being able to seek some form of remedy, whether there is some ability to negotiate. And law firms, I suppose, to the extent that they are not conflicted out of a scenario, and I do make that point because we, for example, would never act in a situation of conflict with any of our existing clients. We can provide pro bono support with respect to discrete questions of law that don't create a conflict. But if it turns out that a law firm can't assist, they're usually particularly well connected, and they can probably direct individuals to experts within the network of legal providers within their area. I think I would flag that, of course, this is talking in the context of perhaps international law firms that might have some of these services available, and I think it's a bit more difficult for smaller law firms to be able to provide that level of engagement, and that might actually be more of a community-based link that could be taken up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sati. You mentioned that there are many variables depending on geographic location, depending on circumstance, depending on access to these remedies and legal providers. And I think very interesting that the team or the agencies developing this policy guidance can take a look at those variables, especially in the ASEAN region and in the West, in the Pacific, etc. They can take a look at these variables and really include it and break it down in this policy guidance, because yeah, according to you, it really falls differently depending on circumstance, depending on location, depending on the harm that is being caused. Thank you so much for highlighting that, Sati. We'll get back to you in a while. For now, we go to Olaf and ask this question. You mentioned in your presentation that in one of the surveys that you've had, children need to be included in the decision making table, and that's what the survey had revealed. Now, in the principles and policy guidelines, child and youth participation in decision making processes, as well as promotion of environmental education, such as environmental knowledge and skills development, have been prioritized. Now, from Save the Children, from your lens, What role do you see civil society actors, especially NGOs like Save the Children, play in advocating those in the work with businesses?
Thanks a lot for the question. And it's something we ask ourselves almost every day at Save the Children. So it's a very relevant question. I think maybe to start with just a general principle, and that's how important it is to respect children's own agency. I think very often a lot of us fall into this trap of seeing children merely as vulnerable or even as victim or as individuals who need our help and protection. And while that is often true, the opposite is also true, that children have a lot of agency, they're actors in their own rights, and they're incredibly creative in finding solutions. And we need to listen to them and hear their own particular vulnerabilities. In terms of how we can do this practically, I think my colleague from Taylor Soms addressed a lot of good steps already, and I mentioned some of them earlier in my presentation. But in the survey I mentioned, we also asked children for their own ideas on how they want to be included. One thing that always came up was this idea of providing a formal platform where children are routinely consulted, both in government but also in the private sector. Children also asked for the creation of particular child and youth forums on the environment, and also for public education to really play an role. So they really stressed the need to include environmental education in high school assignments, for example, or even talked about creating competitions that would help engage children. I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is to be inclusive. Some of these participatory processes exist already, and that's fantastic. But very often, unfortunately, they can be limited to children in urban environments or children who maybe are a little bit more affluent or have it easier to access these processes. So the real challenge and something that we as NGOs really must address is to make sure that these are really inclusive processes that include all children, regardless of age, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, religion, gender, and so on. As NGOs, something else we can do is like really provide a platform and almost be a clearinghouse to help elevate children's voices, because very often we have formal links to decision makers that children don't have, and we can also really help children work on their messaging and so on. I think something we always try to keep in mind when we engage with companies is to not just explain why they have an obligation to include children, to listen to children, but also explain the benefits and like the actual why it actually makes business sense as well to include children in these kind of processes. Maybe one example is that we worked with companies through some partner organization to advocate for inclusion of child-friendly spaces in factories, for example. There can often be a pretty prohibitive initial investment, but it's something that we see pay off in the long run because it increases worker satisfaction, leads to the workers staying longer, for example. So it's often about just thinking creatively about these kind of arguments. And maybe just one final thing I'd like to stress is that as NGOs, we're involved in a lot of formal human rights reporting processes. A lot of this focus on the special procedures in Geneva, and what we have an obligation to do is to make sure that children's voices are included in these processes. One recent example, for example, is in Thailand, where Thailand has gone through is going through the Committee on the Rights of the Child monitoring at the moment. So we've put together with other NGOs in Thailand have worked to include and consult children in this process, making sure that children's voices are highlighted in what we submit, and also help children create their own shadow report, for example, on Thailand. And that's an excellent way of making sure that decision makers hear children's own recommendations straight away through processes that are often close to them or that are prohibitively complicated for children themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Olaf. Inclusivity is the way to go. I think what I got from that as well, and providing a formal platform for children and young people to participate. I think also Olaf was able to mention that it's a multi-stakeholder effort to see prioritizing children's rights to a healthy environment through. And thank you for that, Olaf. Now we will be entertaining some questions from our audience and live viewers. And this first question is for Hashad. Hashad, while waste picking can contribute to sustainable environmental management, It also exposes pickers to health and environmental harms. On the balance of how we reduce these harms to ensure children have access to a healthy environment and access to safe spaces for play. Can you tell us more about this and your insights on this?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And as actors in the informal sector, this question always comes up. Aren't you promoting um, unhealthy practices? Aren't you, as waste pickers, why do you want to continue working in these kind of situations? Don't you want to transition to better, safer, more sustainable livelihoods? Is a question that's always presented to waste pickers, and therefore to their children as well. But the fact of the matter is that this is an occupation that has been around for a very long time. Its nature has changed over the last 2 or 3 decades. In places like India, where liberalization has taken place to a huge extent over the last 15, 20 years, this sector has just grown more and more and more. And the incidence of child labor and children at work has also increased. Even if one were to try and remove waste pickers or transition waste pickers or children of waste pickers away from their current situation into other livelihoods, perhaps through occupational or vocational training, you'd have a different set of people who would simply replace them and continue to do the same work because the sector still demands recycled material for recycling, and there is enough and more poverty prevalent in the country. Therefore, this question arises then that how do we make sure that not only the rights of the waste pickers as well as of their children to a healthy environment are protected while ensuring that they're still able to work, continue working. And I think the question comes down to ensuring that there is dignity to that labor. And that dignity needs to be introduced and protected by the state as well as by non-state actors. As I mentioned before, of course, looking at your own supply chains as well as product stewardship are two ways to do it. But the third other way is to invest financially, invest technologically in generating safer, more sustainable livelihoods for the parents of waste pickers, for the adult waste pickers. Uh, if we focus on that, if we are able to help waste pickers organize a little more, talk to each other, provide them formal spaces for sorting, provide them space for recycling, then you will see that more and more child labor as well as more and more children of waste pickers end up in formal educational spaces.
Mhm.
With years and years of work, we know that the principal driver for a female waste picker is the education of her children. It really doesn't matter what level poverty or social background she's coming from. If you ask a female base picker in our city, in our country, she will say, educating my child is the most important thing for me. So ensuring that they have sustainable livelihoods so that their children are not continuing in that occupation and they end up in safe spaces, as well as providing them safe spaces to work, are both going to ensure that children have this dichotomy of they're doing good work, but they're also in a precarious situation. This can be resolved. Just as an example, if you look at the paper recycling industry, almost 70 to 80% of paper in India gets recycled, and most of it comes from waste pickers, and most of it ends up in huge paper mills, which are run by multi-billion-dollar organizations. If they are a little more responsible, if they pay more, if they ensure that fair sourcing, fair trade practices are being managed across their supply chain, you'll see a huge impact. Last and most importantly, though, often this transition towards sustainable livelihoods means that their livelihoods are not preserved. A lot of the times, you have informal workers being replaced by formal agencies that do the exact same work, perhaps in the exact same manner. And so, invest to generate and protect the livelihoods that are already there. And thereby, I think one will be able to reduce this dichotomy, this contradiction that exists right now.
Thank you, Arshad. Really put a smile to my face when you mentioned dignity to labor. Because I think when we're all overwhelmed with all sorts of information, with all sorts of policy, with all sorts of principle, when we go back to really the heart of it all, which is dignity to labor, I think everything else will follow, as you had mentioned in your answer to that question. Thank you very much, Harshad. This question now from our audience is for it's upon it's upon access to remedy despite court cases the community is still suffering great health issues, according to our question here. Access to remedy has been very difficult for Clitty Creek. I'm not sure if I said that right, but how do we make sure that such an environmentally damaging business or businesses in general are prevented before they take place? I think you need to unmute. It's upon.
Yes, sorry. Yes, yes.
Yes,
Thank you,
no
Val.
worries.
Um, ah, Thank you very much and for this interesting question. But as I have been mentioned before, it's about the prevention from the first place. I think maybe we need to think about the cross-cutting first. The cross-cutting from this question and answer needs to be the transparency and inclusive process. But then how we can go with that? As I told you, number one, we would like to invite and also the
There seems to be a problem with your connection. It's upon. We're trying to fix
hello.
that. Okay, I think
Okay,
that's
can you
better
hear me
now.
now?
Yeah, I
Okay,
can hear you
I might
clearly
need.
now. Can you go back to that answer of yours? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I think the internet connection. Sorry, everyone. So back for my answer for the question, but thank you. That is very good question. And also what I have been mentioned before is about prevent it from before it taking place. So how to do that? The first of all, I would like to invite and also to promote the child rights and business principles adopted in any business sector or investment. Now, to be the policy commitment and look into that area well, but how we can do with that and do the policy, or even use this the time of develop of the guideline, policy guideline for our region, put into your business commitment as a policy commitment first, and then you can look into that how you can deal with it. And the number two is to ensure the right to access to the information to the children group and also participation of them as the OLAF from the Save the Children mentioned a lot about this. And this process is very important because we'll be include the child rights situation analysis and risk assessment, and then how they need to deal with that. So from these two process to be adopted and the policy, the guideline, it can prevent something that happened and also the related problem. But anyhow, and you can see like some business is not create only when they are develop it. Even after the business going on, they can also can create the further harm. For example, as the case the dam in Laos, as I mentioned. So does it mean the protection need to be like the whole process of the protection of the rights of the child? Maybe we need more also the obligation for each state and the business sector now to be adopted and also to follow the regulation well. Recently, we have also discussed about this issue among the Asia with Asia Indonesia in the ASEAN level. We found that right now in Japan, they have national plan of action of the business and human rights, but use the child right as a heart or driven now for their national plan of action. And then if we can do also like that, both in our countries and also as a state and also business a business principle plan that and also policy commitment that is be the prevent more. And in the near future, they have also like the ask for more protected and the legal binding. Now, we would like to call for the optional protocol for child right to healthy environment, which is this whole group right now are involved with that. We would like to have that optional protocol for child right to healthy environment as a legal obligation that can protect it more the children that can get affected for the negative impact for the business activity. So that is might be more protected and then helping them to more before the taking place for every business sector that will be harmful for the children and community. That's all from me now. Wow.
Thank you so much, Itzarapon. It's an important question for businesses to ask themselves, what is our business and policy commitment? And I think Itzarapon really emphasized on that one. We have a question from the audience for Sati. And it reads, climate litigation is pushing businesses towards sustainable actions, but is this enough? How do we shift business practice to respect the environment and future generations in a radical way? And it mentions this is what is needed, exclamation mark. So I think this is a very impassioned question. Sati, yes?
Thank you very much for the question. I think as an initial point, I think we've got to be careful about framing business as some sort of bad actor at all times. Business refers to a span of different types of actors, and in many respects, businesses in a lot of countries have moved much swifter than governments in this space and are in fact leading on the front foot of climate action. I'll refer you to the Climate 100 group who've done an awful lot in this space. And if you look at the US, for example, where they were trailing on climate action, there was local states and businesses as well that were acting very much in the interests of climate action and the environment. But with respect to sort of challenges that businesses are seeing and perhaps the sort of things that are on the horizon as risk, well, it's not just litigation that has been creating risks for businesses. It's been a lot of shareholder action as well, and we'll have seen that at Chevron and ExxonMobil recently. Here in the Australia, we've seen an awful lot of shareholders acting in financial institutions in particular that have been investing in perhaps less climate-friendly investments. And so actually there has been a place and avenues in which those who are vested in businesses have the ability to push for the action that they see as necessary. One thing I think is probably worth flagging is that actually all of this comes down to better awareness. In the same way that a lot of the conversation around children's environmental rights has been, about children's rights on the one hand, environmental rights on the other hand, and actually having the dialogue to bring them together. I think that greater awareness across businesses, absolutely, civil society in general, government, it needs to happen everywhere so that everyone's really across the sort of potential areas of risk and the sort of action that is needed to take steps in the positive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Shati. I really loved how you put that businesses, we are allies in our movement to protect the environment and especially for children. Thank you for that, Sati. In the interest of time, we will not be entertaining any more questions from our online audiences, but rest assured, we have compiled these very interesting questions and we will try to send them to our panelists as well to our agents, as well as to our agencies working on this one. Now, let's wrap up our discussion with some 30-second answers just to close off our panel. What are the practical ways in which the panelists might take forward the recommendations and the principles and policy guidance in your work with business? Very quickly, so that we can close off our discussion. We start with Olaf.
So that, I think this guidelines are hugely relevant. These types of standards are always incredibly helpful for all our work in the region. And I think one very practical way we can take these forward is to make sure that we integrate them in the Red Alert campaign I mentioned before, and make sure that we actually mainstream these standards and tell young climate activists themselves about them and inform them about how they can use them as a measurement tool and as an advocacy tool when they engage with stakeholders, not just governments, but also businesses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olaf. And Harshad?
I'd just like to comment and say I completely agree with Sati's point that that companies and the corporate sector moves far quicker. And a practical way for us to use this in our sector is to use these policy guidelines as an advocacy tool with companies to highlight that these are issues that are being talked about all across the region and not just by one small organization of waste pickers in one corner of the world. I think it brings this question to the fore, and it allows us to negotiate better, not only with corporates, but also with state actors when it comes to protection of child rights. And yeah.
Thank you, Harshad. And it's Sarapon for your closing statement.
Thank you, Tual. For me, I think both government and the business now have the responsibility to provide the remedy for those the children who are affected by the negative impacts of the business activity. So please consider to taking the child rights into the business principles, and in the same time, let's promote the child right to healthy environment together. That is my last comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Sati.
Thank you. I think it provides a really helpful and practical reference point on how to promote respect for children's rights to a healthy environment. Previously, it was much more intangible as a concept, harder to apply in practice. And now we've got a number of resources that are listed that we can go away, refer to, and really understand how to apply this area. I think also it's really good at providing very different perspectives that we might not otherwise have access to. So, for example, where they've talked about the way that those involved in child labour need to be supported afterwards. Well, actually, we advise on modern slavery statements and perhaps didn't have some of that background perspective and couldn't really access that in quite the same way. And then lastly, I think it's really good to get a sense of where future policy trends might be heading, especially as businesses are doing a lot more in the ESG space.
Thank you so much to our panelists for that very incredible and insightful discussion on the policy guidance. I now turn over the discussion to Sonmi Choi from UNICEF to close off this panel. Sonmi?
Great. Thank you so much for this invigorating discussion today. On behalf of the joint UN Regional Initiative on Children's Rights to a Healthy Environment, I would like to thank our speakers and also importantly you, the audience, for joining today's discussion on engaging business to realize children's rights to a healthy environment. It's really, all the panelist discussions really highlighted the importance of ensuring transparency in business supply chains, enforcing children's access to remedy, access to information, also their right to participate in business investment decision-making process, as well as importance of supporting legal empowerment for children and youth and marginalized communities, and raising children's voices and empowering them in climate actions. And I would like to also conclude that from the three UN agencies' perspective, it is really important to recognize that climate crisis is also a child rights crisis. And children in our region are really on the front line of the climate crisis. As we discussed today throughout the whole conversation in the session, and also highlighted clearly in our policy guidance, businesses have a really important crucial role to play in safeguarding children's rights to a healthy and sustainable environment, including through precautionary and preventive measures. Business impacts on children's environmental rights can be at multiple spatial and temporal scales, as we see in the case of air pollution and climate change. So businesses in this region need to really step up together with us, raise their own climate and environmental ambition, increase speed and scale of climate and environmental sustainability actions, and we all have to collectively help bridge net zero global emissions and close the climate adaptation and finance gap. So we call for businesses and other stakeholders to join us in this increasing global momentum for children's environmental rights. Also, we're really calling for our business partners to explicitly incorporate children's environmental rights across their value chains and to explicitly support children's environmental education, skills development, as well as green entrepreneurship for millions of young people who would need our support in this region. So through this our joint UN initiative, we'll continue our efforts to strengthen a policy, regulatory, and incentive mechanisms. So upholding children's environmental rights to a healthy environment is actually firmly established as a viable business model that makes good business sense. So we look forward to collaborating with you all, business stakeholders, as well as states, civil society actors, to increase accountability of businesses, but also encourage and acknowledge business partners that respect and promote children's rights to a healthy and sustainable environment. So we wish you to thank everyone, especially our panelists and the audience for joining our discussion. Hope to see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.